Well, there's some problems with that theory. Always keep in mind that the Bible never contradicts itself. And so if someone comes up with some theory and it goes against Scriptures, then the theory is not right. If you and I are looking at something and I have one thought and you have another thought about the same thing in the Bible, then one of us is wrong and we both may be wrong. God says what He means and means what He says. So Scriptures do not contradict itself. Consider Eve in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 20. You notice there what Eve's name means? Eve is the mother of all living. Now, if she is the mother of all living, who does that leave out? The only one I can think of that could possibly leave out would be Adam, because she was taken from Adam, from his rib. But from that point on, it says Eve was the mother of all living. Paul makes the argument based on the role of Adam and Eve and being the father and mother of us all. He says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 that by one man sin entered the world. By one man. That's all that there was. There was a man and there was a woman. Even more pointed verse than that is in Acts chapter 17. Paul is talking to some Gentiles on Mars Hill, there in Athens, Greece. And he's talking to them about God. They didn't know anything much about God and how God created everything. And he said God made from one every nation. And so the idea that somehow God created other humans to go along with Adam and Eve just does not fit what the Scriptures say in other places. And so the theory that says God created many other people just cannot be right, else the Bible contradicts itself. Therefore, that being the case, if Eve is the mother of all living, and God made from one all the nations of the earth, the only conclusion we can draw is that Cain married one of the only other women in existence, who would be either his sister or possibly a niece. Now, we think, oh, that just sounds, that's just doesn't sound right, does it? Think about the Bible days. Nahor, for instance, married his niece Milcah just a few chapters later, Genesis chapter 11. Abraham, first known as Abram, the great patriarch Abraham, married his half-sister Sarah, Genesis chapter 20 and verse 12. Now we assume that Cain was the oldest, and indeed he may have been. But Adam lived to be 930 years old. And the Bible says in Genesis chapter 5, in verse 4 and 5, he had sons and daughters. See, Cain and Abel and later Seth were not the only children that Adam and Eve had, but they are the children through whom the story of the Bible will come through. People continue to marry their near relatives until many years later, when God gave the law of Moses on Mount Sinai. And in Leviticus chapter 18, God lays down some laws now. It says, now you don't marry folks too close kin to you. One of the reasons thought that was not a problem at that time is that man was genetically perfect when God made him. And so as they married nearer kin, it did not have the consequences genetically that it does today. Evolutionists claim, that's another issue here that we can address from Genesis. Evolutionists claim that man learned basic skills over long periods of time. One of the things they argued about Moses writing the first 5 books of the Bible is that, well, folks didn't write back then. It's as if man was just too primitive to have a written language. But that doesn't match what the Bible says. When God created Adam and Eve, they were very intelligent. We're not told a lot of the details about what they did. They had the ability to choose whether to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil or not, and to tend the garden and keep it and such. They knew how to do all of that. Abel comes along. What does Abel do? He domesticated animals. He was a keeper of sheep. Cain, he's there. He's a farmer. They knew how to cultivate the land. They knew how to build a fire to offer the offering that they offered. we find that there in Genesis chapter 4 and a little bit in chapter 5, that why they had those like Jabal, who was the father of those who play various instruments of music. Aren't you glad they invented those? I enjoy the music that we're able to make. And so they had that. They had those who knew how to work with bronze and iron, and you know, the archaeologists and the folks like that will talk about the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and so on, as if that was some new thing, thousands of years in the making, and often millions of years, and then thousands of years to go from one age to the next. And yet the Bible says here in Genesis, in chapter 4, about those skilled with working with bronze and with iron. And so there are many things in Genesis that shows man's thinking is not right about how primitive man started out. And you know, you have the thing about the caveman and such as that. Well, let's turn in our Bibles now and look at Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 19. It starts off, it tells an interesting story about Lamech and how he took 2 wives, and you see people are multiplying. In fact, if you take Genesis chapter 5, you'll see the genealogies listed there, which shows how we have enough people for God to come then in the next chapter and talk about how wicked man was when he brings the flood. The people, some of the information is given how the people are multiplying from Adam and Eve, and then there are many people. But starting back in chapter 4 verse 19, talks about a man named Lamech, and it goes through his story. And then it says in verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, for God had appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. What we want to see is that we have a contrast in Cain's descendants, which was back in verse 19. He was a descendant of Cain. And then in verse 26, we have Seth being born, and then his son named Enosh.